What happens when the most powerful women in the world are left alone with their thoughts? Did they spend their time just signing decrees and wearing crowns? Or did they retreat into strange secret worlds of their own making? The worlds filled with perfumed sheep, rooms made of amber, and ghosts captured on glass plates. Or worlds that cost fortunes and sometimes even their own lives. What did they need to escape from so badly? And what do these hidden passions tell us about the women behind the thrones? Number 16, did Empress Cixi breed dogs to control an empire? Empress Dowager Cixi's favorite dog was named Shadza. She fed the dog with shark fins and curds from the milk of a specific antelope. She employed 4 eunuchs whose only job was to care for her pack of Pekingese dogs. These dogs were not allowed to be sold. They were given as high-level diplomatic gifts, or, if they displeased her, killed. The penalty for stealing one of her dogs was death. Cixi ruled China for nearly 50 years. She was a master of political theater and power, but behind the walls of the Forbidden City, she had a softer, more obsessive side. She was devoted to breeding Pekingese dogs. This wasn't just a casual affection for pets, it was a serious, lifelong project. The Pekingese were considered sacred in China. They were called lion dogs, believed to be descended from the mythical Fu dogs that guarded Buddhist temples. They were exclusively owned by the imperial family. Cixi took this tradition and turned it into a personal art form. Her kennels were located in a special pavilion. They were managed with the same precision as a government ministry. Each dog had its own records detailing its lineage, its temperament, and its physical characteristics. Cixi had very specific standards. She favored dogs with flat faces, large eyes, and long flowing coats. She especially loved the sleeve Pekingese. These were tiny dogs, small enough to be carried in the wide sleeves of her robes. They acted as tiny, living hand warmers and personal guards. If she felt threatened, a sleeve dog could leap out and startle an attacker. She spent hours each day with her dogs. She would watch them play in their dedicated marble courtyard. She personally supervised their feeding. Their diets were elaborate. They ate rice, beef, and exotic broths. They were groomed constantly. Their long hair was combed and sometimes tied with ribbons. Cixi gave them names like sea otter or dragon. She talked to them. She treated them like her children, or perhaps more accurately, like extensions of her own imperial majesty. This hobby was more than just a pastime. It was a display of power. Owning these dogs was a privilege no one else in China had. The quality of her dogs was a reflection of the quality of her court. She controlled their bloodlines with an iron fist. She decided which dogs would breed. She was creating a perfect, miniature dynasty of canines that mirrored her control over the human dynasty of the Qing. When she gave a dog to a foreign diplomat, it was a calculated move. It was a gift that was both priceless and a reminder of her superior status. It said, "I am giving you something you could never get on your own." Her other related hobby was botany. She loved flowers, especially orchids and chrysanthemums. She had vast greenhouses built in the Forbidden City and at her summer palace. She would spend her mornings walking through her gardens, inspecting the plants. She learned their Latin names. She directed the gardeners on how to cultivate them. This wasn't just about enjoying their beauty. It was about creating a perfect, controlled environment. Nature, like her court, had to bend to her will. She hosted elaborate flower viewing parties. Courtiers would write poems about her prize-winning blooms. Her fascination with botany and dog breeding reveals a deep need for order and control. In a chaotic political world, her gardens and her kennels were places where she was the undisputed creator. Everything was beautiful, ordered, and obedient. It was a small, perfect world she could manage completely, a sharp contrast to the sprawling, crumbling empire outside her palace walls. Number 15 was Marie Antoinette just playing dress up. Her personal farm cost over 2 million livres to build and maintain. Her prize sheep were washed and decorated with ribbons. She used porcelain milking pails made by the Royal Sèvres factory. The villagers were often courtiers in costume or carefully selected staff. Marie Antoinette is remembered for her extravagance, but one of her most famous projects was not about gold or jewels. It was about pretending to be poor. She built a fantasy farm in the gardens of Versailles. It was called the Hameau de la Reine, or the Queen's Hamlet. It was a complete functioning peasant village. It had a farmhouse, a dairy, a mill, a dovecote, and a barn. It was designed by the best architects. It looked rustic from the outside, with thatched roofs and weathered wood. But inside, the cottages were furnished with silk and fine furniture. The Queen's personal house in the hamlet had a boudoir and a billiard room. This was her escape. The court of Versailles was a suffocating place. Every moment was public. Getting dressed in the morning was a ceremony attended by dozens of nobles. Walking down a hallway was a political act. The Hameau was a place where she could pretend to be a normal person. She and her closest friends would go there. They would change out of their stiff court gowns. They wore simple muslin dresses. They called themselves by pastoral names. The queen would be a milkmaid or a shepherdess. But their version of farm life was a fantasy. The animals were handpicked for their beauty. The cows and sheep were cleaned daily. The farm work was real, but it was done by actual farmers who lived nearby. The queen and her friends would just watch or perform small, clean tasks. Marie Antoinette would collect eggs from the hen house. She would milk a cow into her custom-made, hand-painted porcelain pail. It was a performance of simplicity. The project was incredibly expensive. The cost of building and landscaping the Hameau was enormous. Then there was the ongoing cost of staff, animals, and maintenance. All of this was happening while France was heading toward bankruptcy. The real peasants of France were starving. They couldn't afford bread. And here was their queen spending a fortune to pretend to be one of them. It created an image of her that was deeply damaging. She seemed frivolous and completely out of touch with the reality of her people's suffering. Why did she do it? It wasn't just about fun, it was part of a larger cultural trend. The French aristocracy was fascinated by the idea of the natural man, inspired by philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They romanticized rural life. They saw it as pure and honest, a contrast to the corruption of the court. But they wanted the aesthetic of poverty without any of the actual hardship. The Hameau was the ultimate expression of this fantasy. It allowed Marie Antoinette to experience a simple life that was anything but. It was a carefully constructed stage set. Her hobby wasn't farming. Her hobby was playing a character. It was a desperate attempt to find a sense of self away from the crushing pressures of being queen. But the fantasy she built for her own escape helped fuel the revolution that would ultimately consume her. Number 14, could Queen Elizabeth I's hobby have gotten her executed? Before she was queen, Elizabeth spent over 2 months imprisoned in the Tower of London. Her half-sister, Queen Mary I, suspected her of treason. During that time, she scratched a defiant couplet into a window with a diamond, "Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be." She translated Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a work about finding wisdom in times of hardship, in just a few weeks. She did this while she was under house arrest, fearing for her life. Queen Elizabeth I was one of the most powerful monarchs in English history. She was a skilled politician, a brilliant strategist, and a master of propaganda, but she was also a serious intellectual. Her secret passion was translation. This wasn't a light hobby. It was a rigorous academic pursuit. She was fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. She could also speak Spanish and Welsh. From a young age, her education was her refuge. It was the one thing she could control in a dangerous and uncertain world. Her hobby was translating classical and religious texts. She would spend hours in her private chambers working on difficult passages of Horace or Cicero. This was highly unusual for a woman of her time, even a royal one. Intellectual pursuits were considered the domain of men. But for Elizabeth, it was more than just a pastime. It was a way to sharpen her mind. Translating required precision, logic, and a deep understanding of language. These were the same skills she used to govern her kingdom. When she negotiated with foreign ambassadors, she could often do so in their own language without needing an interpreter. This gave her a huge advantage. Her choice of texts was also revealing. She often translated works that dealt with themes of power, suffering, and justice. She translated parts of Seneca, a Roman philosopher who wrote about stoicism and the duties of a ruler. She translated a long, complex religious poem by Marguerite de Navarre. This was a private act. She didn't publish these works under her own name. They were for her own intellectual and spiritual development. It was a way for her to think through the immense pressures of her position. How should a monarch rule justly? How does one endure betrayal and hardship? These were not abstract questions for her. They were matters of life and death. This hobby could have been dangerous. In her youth, her Protestant faith and her intelligence made her a threat to her Catholic sister, Mary. Her deep engagement with religious texts could have been interpreted as heresy. Her command of languages meant she could read forbidden books and communicate in secret. Her intellect was part of what made her so threatening to her enemies, but as queen, it became one of her greatest assets. Her hobby wasn't just about words. It was about mastering the art of communication and understanding the deep currents of European thought. It was the intellectual forge where she hammered out the skills she needed to survive and rule in a man's world. Number 13. Did Queen Victoria talk to the dead? After her husband Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She had his clothes laid out every evening and a bowl of hot water brought to his room for his morning shave every day until her own death. She slept with a plaster cast of his hand. She commissioned thousands of portraits, statues, and memorials to him. Queen Victoria's grief was legendary, but it also led her to a very strange hobby, spiritualism. In the mid-19th century, there was a widespread fascination with contacting the dead. Seances, mediums, and spirit photography became popular. The Queen, desperate to communicate with her beloved Albert, was drawn into this world. This was a closely guarded secret. It would have been a major scandal if it were widely known that the head of the Church of England was trying to talk to ghosts. Her main connection to the spirit world was a servant named John Brown. He was a Scottish gillie who had worked for Albert. After Albert's death, Victoria brought Brown to court. He was rough, outspoken, and treated the Queen with a familiarity that shocked everyone. He would tell her what to do, and she would obey. Many believed he was a medium. He claimed he could channel Prince Albert's spirit. He would tell Victoria what Albert wanted her to do. He would pass on messages of comfort and advice from the beyond. And Victoria became completely dependent on him. Whether Brown was a genuine medium or a clever manipulator is unknown. But he gave the Queen what she needed, a continuing connection to her dead husband. They would hold private seances at Windsor Castle and at her estate in Balmoral, Scotland. These were not public events. They were held in secret with only a few trusted people present. Another aspect of this hobby was spirit photography. This was a new technology where photographers claimed they could capture images of ghosts on their glass plates. A ghostly figure would appear next to the living subject. Victoria was fascinated by this. She collected these photographs. She may have even tried to have her own picture taken with the spirit of Albert. This was an era of rapid scientific advancement, but also a time of great spiritual searching. For Victoria, science and spiritualism were not opposites. Photography was a modern marvel. Why couldn't it also capture things beyond the visible world? Her interest in the occult went against everything she represented in public. She was the symbol of a stable Christian, rational empire. But in private, she was a grieving widow exploring the fringes of belief. This hobby reveals the profound depth of her personal sorrow. Her public image was one of stoic duty, but her private life was consumed by a desperate and deeply unconventional quest to overcome death itself. It shows a side of the famous queen that is rarely seen, a vulnerable woman willing to try anything to hear her husband's voice one more time. Number 12, why did Catherine the Great carve her own jewelry? Catherine the Great owned the great imperial crown of Russia, which was decorated with 4,936 diamonds. Her collection included the 189-carat Orlov diamond, which she had set into the imperial scepter. She commissioned a room in her palace to be made entirely of amber, a project that took decades and nearly bankrupted its original patron. She possessed so many jewels that on some state occasions her dress was so heavy she could barely walk. With all this wealth, it seems strange that one of Catherine the Great's favorite hobbies was to make her own jewelry. She was a master of gem carving. This is an incredibly difficult and precise art form. It involves using small, sharp tools to carve intricate designs into hard stones like agate, jasper, and carnelian. These are called intaglios or cameos. An intaglio has the design cut into the stone, while a cameo has the design raised from the background. Catherine didn't just dabble in this. She was a serious practitioner. She had her own workshop set up in the Winter Palace. She owned professional-grade equipment, including a lathe powered by a foot pedal. She spent hours at her workbench carefully cutting and polishing stones. She corresponded with the leading gem carvers in Europe. She wasn't just a patron of the arts, she was an artist herself. She created hundreds of pieces. Many of them were portraits of classical figures or scenes from mythology. This hobby was a strange choice for an empress. It was manual labor, it was solitary, it required intense concentration and patience. But that was probably the appeal. Catherine's life was a whirlwind of politics, court intrigue, and ruling a vast empire. Gem carving was an escape. In her workshop, she was not Catherine the Great, Empress of all the Russias. She was just a craftswoman focused on the tiny, perfect world she was creating in a piece of stone. It was a form of meditation. It also connected her to the classical world she admired so much. The art of gem carving was ancient, practiced by the Greeks and Romans. By mastering it, Catherine was placing herself in a long line of enlightened rulers who valued art and culture. She was a product of the Enlightenment. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot. She saw herself as a philosopher queen. Her hobby was a physical expression of her intellectual interests. She also built one of the most incredible gem collections in the world. She bought entire collections from European nobles. At one point, her collection of carved gems numbered over 10,000 pieces. She kept them in specially designed cabinets. She would study them with a magnifying glass. Her own work was displayed alongside these ancient masterpieces. This hobby reveals a fascinating side of Catherine. She wasn't just a consumer of luxury. She was a creator. She had a deep, personal understanding of the skill and artistry that went into the objects she collected. It was a very private passion that connected her to history, art, and a quiet place within herself, far from the demands of the throne. Number 11 was Queen Alexandra, a royal paparazzo. Queen Alexandra, wife of King Edward VII of Britain, had a permanent dark mark on her finger from pressing the shutter button of her camera. She had a dark room installed on the royal yacht, the HMY Victoria and Albert, so she could develop her photos while traveling. She submitted her photos to public exhibitions, sometimes under a pseudonym. The public company Kodak used her name and image for advertising, making her one of the first celebrity endorsers. Long before everyone had a camera in their pocket, Queen Alexandra was an obsessive photographer. She got her first camera in 1888, and it quickly became her constant companion. This was at a time when photography was still a complicated technical process. It involved heavy equipment, glass plates, and chemical development. It was not a casual hobby, but Alexandra embraced it completely. She took pictures of everything. She documented the private lives of the royal family in a way that had never been done before. She took candid photos of her children, her husband, and her other relatives, including the Russian royal family. Her sister was the Tsarina. Her photos show them relaxing, playing games, and being informal. This was a radical departure from the stiff, formal portraits that were the public face of royalty. She was, in a sense, the first royal Instagrammer. She was capturing the behind-the-scenes moments of the world's most famous family. Her hobby was not always popular with her subjects. She was known for being relentless. She would surprise people, taking their pictures when they were not expecting it. She would climb on furniture to get the right angle. Winston Churchill once complained about her flashing her Kodak at one. She was capturing a raw, unpolished reality that the monarchy wasn't used to showing. But she was also a talented photographer. She had a good eye for composition. Her photos were not just snapshots, they were well-crafted images. She organized them into beautiful leather-bound albums. She gave these albums as gifts to family and friends. In 1908, she even published a book of her photographs to raise money for charity. The book, called Queen Alexandra's Christmas Gift Book, was a huge success. It gave the public an unprecedented glimpse into the private world of the royals. This hobby did more than just pass the time. It changed the public's relationship with the monarchy. Her photos made the royal family seem more human, more relatable. They were not just distant figures in formal portraits. They were parents, children, and siblings, just like everyone else. Alexandra used her hobby to shape the public image of her family. She was a pioneer, using a new technology to communicate directly with the people. It was a clever way of managing public relations long before the term was invented. Her fascination with photography shows her modern sensibility. She understood the power of the image, and through her lens, she gave us a unique and intimate record of a world that was about to disappear forever. Number 10. Did Queen Christina of Sweden try to turn lead into gold? At the age of 28, Queen Christina of Sweden abdicated her throne. This was a shocking act. She was a popular and powerful monarch. She then converted to Catholicism, which was illegal in Sweden, and moved to Rome. She left behind her entire kingdom to pursue a life of intellectual and spiritual freedom. She once held a party where she installed a vomitorium so her guests could overindulge, a detail that was likely an exaggeration but spoke to her scandalous reputation. After giving up her crown, Christina of Sweden dedicated her life to her true passions: art, science, and alchemy. Alchemy was the medieval forerunner of chemistry. Its most famous goal was the transmutation of base metals, like lead, into gold. But it was also a complex spiritual philosophy. Alchemists believed that by purifying metals, they could also purify their own souls. For Christina, this was a serious scientific and philosophical pursuit. She set up a laboratory in her Roman palace. It was filled with furnaces, beakers, and strange chemicals. She worked with prominent alchemists and scientists of the day. She spent a fortune on her experiments. She was not just a patron, she was an active participant. She would spend long nights in her lab conducting experiments, recording her observations, and trying to unlock the secrets of matter. This was a bizarre and dangerous hobby for a former queen. The Catholic Church was suspicious of alchemy. It was often associated with heresy and magic. Christina had to be careful, but she was driven by a powerful curiosity. She wanted to understand the fundamental nature of the universe. She was part of the scientific revolution, a time when old ideas were being challenged and new discoveries were being made every day. Her laboratory was a place of intellectual ferment. Her interest was not just in gold. She was fascinated by the idea of the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance that could supposedly grant eternal life. This speaks to her deep spiritual searching. After abandoning her Lutheran faith and her royal duties, she was looking for a new source of meaning and purpose. Alchemy offered a path to both knowledge and enlightenment. Christina's other great passion was collecting. She amassed one of the greatest art collections in Europe. She also collected scientific instruments, rare books, and manuscripts. Her palace in Rome became a kind of private museum and academy. She hosted salons where the greatest thinkers, artists, and scientists of the age would gather to discuss new ideas. Her life in Rome was a continuation of her rule in Sweden, but on her own terms. She was no longer a political queen, but she had become a queen of culture. Her pursuit of alchemy reveals her unconventional and rebellious spirit. She refused to be limited by the expectations of her time. She gave up a throne to be free to ask her own questions and seek her own answers. She was a woman who valued knowledge above power. Her strange hobby was not just a whim, it was the central quest of her post-royal life, a search for the ultimate truths of the universe, conducted in the fiery heat of her own private furnace. Number 9 was Queen Liliuokalani's music a form of protest. In 1895, after the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy, Queen Liliuokalani was arrested by the new government. She was accused of treason and imprisoned in a single room in Iolani Palace, the very palace where she had once ruled. She was denied any visitors and was only allowed one lady in waiting. She was held there for nearly 8 months. During her imprisonment, she composed some of her most famous music on scraps of newspaper because she was denied proper sheet music. Liliuokalani was the last reigning monarch of the Kingdom of Hawaii, but she was also a gifted and prolific musical composer. Music was not just a hobby for her, it was a central part of her identity and her reign. She wrote over 150 songs in her lifetime. Her most famous work is Aloha Way, which is often seen as a gentle song of farewell, but she wrote it after witnessing a tender goodbye between two lovers, and it later became a symbol of the loss of her kingdom. Her musical education started early. She was a talented singer with perfect pitch. She could play the piano, organ, ukulele, and guitar. But her real genius was in composition. She blended traditional Hawaiian melodies with the Western musical styles she learned from missionaries. The result was a unique sound that was both Hawaiian and modern. Her music was a form of cultural preservation. As outside influences grew stronger in Hawaii, her songs helped to keep Hawaiian language and traditions alive. When she was a princess, she would host musical evenings at her home. She and her siblings formed a royal quartet. They would perform for guests, sharing their love of music. This was part of her diplomatic charm. Music was a way to connect with people, to share her culture, and to build relationships. But after she became queen and was later overthrown, her music took on a new meaning. It became her voice when she was silenced. During her imprisonment, composing was an act of survival and resistance. The songs she wrote in her palace prison were filled with sorrow, longing, and a deep love for her people and her land. They were a way to process her grief and to maintain her dignity in the face of humiliation. One of her most powerful prison compositions is The Queen's Prayer, a song that asks for forgiveness for her enemies and for the preservation of her people. After her release, she continued to use her music as a political tool. She traveled to the United States to advocate for the restoration of her monarchy. She would perform her songs, using them to tell the story of her people and to win sympathy for her cause. Her hobby was not a private escape. It was a public declaration of her identity as a Hawaiian and as a queen. It was her most powerful weapon in a fight she ultimately could not win. Her songs are her lasting legacy. They are beautiful melodies, but they are also historical documents filled with the pain and pride of a queen who lost her kingdom but never lost her voice. Number 8. Did Queen Isabella's hobby change the world of gaming? Isabella I of Castile personally financed Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492, pledging to sell her own jewels if necessary. She and her husband Ferdinand of Aragon united Spain and completed the Reconquista, ending nearly 800 years of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. She established the Spanish Inquisition. She was a mother to 5 children, including Catherine of Aragon, the future first wife of Henry V of England. Isabella was a formidable ruler, known for her piety, intelligence, and ruthless determination. In her spare time, she was an avid chess player. This was not just a game for her, it was a reflection of her life. Chess is a game of strategy, foresight, and power. It is a game of war and politics played on a board of 64 squares. For a queen whose reign was defined by these very things, chess was the perfect pastime. But Isabella didn't just play chess. She is credited with inspiring the most significant rule change in the game's history. In the 15th century, chess was a much slower game. The piece we know as the queen was then called the vizier or furs. It was one of the weakest pieces on the board. It could only move 1 square at a time diagonally. The game could take days to finish. Around the end of the 15th century, during Isabella's reign in Spain, a new version of the game emerged. It was called La Quena de la Dama, or the Queen's Chess. In this new version, the queen was transformed. She became the most powerful piece on the board. She could move any number of squares in any direction, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. This single change revolutionized the game. It made chess faster, more dynamic, and more exciting. Historians believe this change was directly inspired by Isabella herself. She was the most powerful female ruler in Europe. She was a queen who commanded armies, made treaties, and shaped the course of nations. It makes sense that in a country ruled by such a dominant queen, the game of chess would be updated to reflect this reality. The new all-powerful chess queen was a mirror of Queen Isabella. She played chess with her husband, her children, and members of her court. It was a way to teach her children about strategy and to test the wits of her advisors. It was a miniature version of the political and military battles she fought every day. The chessboard was a safe place to practice the art of power. Isabella's connection to this change in chess shows how a monarch's personality can influence culture in unexpected ways. Her hobby wasn't just a way to relax, it was connected to her identity as a powerful female ruler. She left her mark not only on the map of the world through the voyages she sponsored, but also on the timeless game of chess. Every time someone plays a game of chess today, they are playing with a piece whose power was inspired by a remarkable Spanish queen. Number 7 was Empress Cixi's gym, her personal torture chamber. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known as Cixi, had a waist that measured just 19.5 inches. She achieved this through a process called tight lacing, where her corsets were pulled so tight it sometimes took an hour to get them on. She had her own private gym installed in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, complete with rings, a pommel horse, and parallel bars. She would spend several hours each day exercising. Her hair was so long it reached the floor. Washing it was an all-day affair, and the weight of it often gave her headaches. Cixi was celebrated as one of the most beautiful women in Europe, but maintaining that beauty was a grueling, obsessive, and deeply bizarre hobby. Her life was a relentless pursuit of physical perfection. This was not about health, it was about control. She felt trapped in the rigid, formal Austrian court. She had little political power and was constantly criticized by her mother-in-law. Her body was the one thing she could completely dominate. Her exercise routine was extreme. She would wake up early and begin her workouts. She used the gymnastic equipment to maintain her slender figure and muscle tone. She was also a fanatic horsewoman, considered one of the best in the world. She would spend hours in the saddle, riding at dangerous speeds. She went on long, brutal hikes, walking for hours at a fast pace, exhausting her ladies in waiting who were forced to accompany her. Her diet was just as extreme. She went through periods of near starvation. She would sometimes eat only the juice of raw beef or thin broth. She drank violet sorbet and was obsessed with her weight. She was weighed up to 3 times a day. If she gained even a tiny amount, she would begin another punishing diet. She was essentially a high-functioning anorexic. This obsession with her body was a way of coping with her profound unhappiness. She was married at 16 to Emperor Franz Joseph. She was not prepared for the strictures of court life. She was a free spirit, and she felt like a bird in a gilded cage. Her beauty was her primary value at court, so she clung to it and perfected it. But it was also a weapon. Her refusal to eat and her constant exercise were forms of passive resistance. They were ways of saying no to the world that was trying to control her. Her private gymnasium was her sanctuary and her prison. It was a place where she could push her body to its limits. The physical pain of the workout was a distraction from her emotional pain. It was a bizarre hobby for an empress. Women in the 19th century were supposed to be delicate and demure. Cixi was an athlete. She was strong and disciplined, but her strength was turned inward, against herself. Her obsession with fitness and beauty was not a sign of vanity. It was a symptom of a deep and lasting psychological distress. It was the strange, sad hobby of a woman who had everything and nothing at the same time. Number 6, did Queen Mary use a royal gaze to get what she wanted? Queen Mary, the wife of King George V of Britain, once admired a set of small silver dishes at a dinner party. The next morning, a royal van arrived at the host's house to collect them. She visited a wealthy duke and commented on how much she liked a particular set of antique chairs. The duke knowing her reputation, had the chairs smashed to pieces after she left so you wouldn't be forced to give them to her. She was known to have a royal gaze. If she fixed her eyes on an object in someone's home and said how much she liked it, the owner was expected to offer it as a gift. Queen Mary's hobby was collecting, but she was not just a collector, she was a hoarder on a royal scale, and her methods were notoriously aggressive. She had a deep love for art, antiques, and objects with royal history, especially anything related to her own family, the House of Teck. She spent her life trying to reacquire items that had been sold off or given away by previous generations of royals. Her collecting went far beyond simply buying things. She used her position as queen to pressure people into giving her their prized possessions. Her visits to the country houses of the British aristocracy were feared. She would tour the house, her expert eye scanning for treasures. When she found something she wanted, she would hint, and then hint more strongly. It was almost impossible to refuse the queen. To do so would be a major social and political misstep. People would hide their best things when they knew she was coming. She filled her homes, Sandringham House, and eventually Marlborough House, with her acquisitions. The rooms were crammed with furniture, porcelain, jade, and Faberge eggs. She was not just accumulating objects, she was meticulously cataloging them. She spent hours every day working on her collection. She would research the history of each piece, label it, and arrange it just so. This was the work of a serious curator, but her acquisition methods were more like those of a predator. Why was she so obsessed? Part of it came from her upbringing. Her family, the Tecks, were minor German royals with a grand title but not much money. She grew up in a state of genteel poverty. As queen, she was determined to surround herself with the security and permanence that beautiful, valuable objects represented. Collecting was also a way for her to assert her own identity and intelligence. She became a genuine expert in decorative arts. It was a field where she could be more knowledgeable than her husband and his advisors. Her hobby reveals a complex personality. She was a woman of immense public dignity and private ruthlessness. She was dedicated to preserving the history of the monarchy, but she was willing to bully her own subjects to do it. Her endless collecting was a way of shoring up the foundations of the royal house, piece by piece. She was reassembling a scattered heritage, creating a tangible link to the past. But her methods left a trail of resentful nobles who had been victims of her powerful royal gaze. Number 5. Could a queen's love for plants change an empire's economy? Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III of Britain, helped to pay for the voyages of the famous botanist Joseph Banks. She had a menagerie at her home that included one of the first kangaroos ever seen in England. She learned to read and write English by studying the plays of Shakespeare. She and the king had 15 children, 13 of whom survived to adulthood. Queen Charlotte was more than just a royal wife and mother. She was a serious amateur botanist. Her passion for plants helped to transform a royal garden into one of the most important scientific institutions in the world. That garden was Kew. When Charlotte came to England from Germany to marry the king, Kew was a pleasant royal retreat. She and the king loved it there. But Charlotte, with her keen interest in botany, saw a greater potential. She took a personal interest in the development of the gardens. She worked closely with the top botanists and gardeners of the day, including Joseph Banks, who had traveled the world with Captain Cook. She sponsored plant hunting expeditions to faraway lands. These expeditions would bring back exotic, new species of plants to England. Kew Gardens became a showcase for the botanical treasures of the growing British Empire. Charlotte had her own private botanical library. She studied the plants that were brought to Kew. She learned their Latin names and their properties. She was particularly fascinated by the flora of Australia. She helped to oversee the cultivation of many Australian plants at Kew for the first time. She also created a flower book where she cataloged and drew the plants in her collection. This hobby was more than just a pleasant way to spend time. It had real scientific and economic importance. Kew Gardens was not just a pretty park. It was a center for botanical research. Scientists at Kew studied the plants to see how they could be used. They experimented with moving plants from one part of the empire to another. For example, they were instrumental in transferring rubber trees from Brazil to plantations in Asia, a move that had enormous economic consequences. They also worked with breadfruit, which they hoped could be a cheap food source for slaves in the Caribbean. And Queen Charlotte's patronage was crucial to this work. Her royal support gave Kew Gardens the prestige, and funding it needed to grow. She turned her personal passion into a national asset. She understood that botany was not just about pretty flowers. It was about knowledge, commerce, and power. The plants collected at Kew were a living symbol of the reach and influence of the British Empire. Her hobby reveals an intelligent and forward-thinking woman. While her husband, King George III, struggled with mental illness, Charlotte found purpose and intellectual stimulation in her gardens. She created a lasting legacy. Today, Kew Gardens is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a world leader in plant science. It all started, in part, with the Queen's quiet, personal love for flowers. Number 4, did a pharaoh queen build monuments to erase a man? Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh of ancient Egypt, ruled for over 20 years. To legitimize her rule, she often had herself depicted in official art as a man, complete with a male body and a false beard. After her death, her successor, Thutmose III, tried to erase her from history. He had her name and image chiseled off monuments throughout Egypt. Her magnificent mortuary temple was designed to tell the story of her divine birth, claiming that the god Amun was her true father. Hatshepsut's hobby was architecture, but she pursued it on a scale that only a pharaoh could. She was one of the most prolific builders in Egyptian history. Her reign was a time of peace and prosperity, and she used the country's wealth to launch massive construction projects up and down the Nile. This was not just about creating beautiful buildings, it was a sophisticated political and religious strategy. Her hobby was, in effect, building her own legend in stone. Her greatest achievement was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. It is one of the most stunning buildings ever created. It is a series of colonnaded terraces carved into the side of a cliff. It looks both ancient and incredibly modern. The temple was not just a tomb, it was a piece of propaganda. The walls are covered in detailed carvings that tell the story of her life, but it is a carefully curated story. It shows her being crowned by the gods. It depicts her famous trade expedition to the land of Punt, a far-off place rich in gold, incense, and exotic animals. The temple was designed to convince the people that her rule was legitimate and divinely ordained. She also erected massive obelisks at the great temple of Karnak. These were single pieces of granite, almost 100 feet tall, that were quarried, transported, and erected using incredible feats of engineering. One of her obelisks at Karnak is still the tallest standing in Egypt. She had inscriptions carved on their bases, boasting about her accomplishments and her devotion to the gods. She wrote that she wanted to create things which had never been done before. Her building projects were a way of asserting her power in a male-dominated world. As a female pharaoh, her position was precarious. She had to constantly prove her right to rule. By building on a grander scale than the male pharaohs who came before her, she was demonstrating her strength and her worthiness. Her monuments were designed to last for eternity. They were her way of ensuring that her name would never be forgotten. This hobby was all-consuming. It required a huge portion of the state's resources. It employed thousands of workers, from architects and engineers to stonecutters and laborers. Hatshepsut was personally involved in the planning and design. Her building program was the central project of her reign. Ironically, her successor tried to undo all of her work. Thutmose III, her stepson, who had waited in the wings for years while she ruled, seemed to resent her success. His campaign to erase her memory was thorough, but it was not complete. Archaeologists have been able to piece together the story of her reign from the fragments that remain. Her greatest monument, her temple at Deir el-Bahri, still stands. Her strange, magnificent hobby of self-mythologizing through architecture ultimately succeeded. She built a legacy so powerful that even the most determined efforts could not completely destroy it. Number 3 was Anne Boleyn's hobby of royal power play. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry V of England, had a personal emblem of a white falcon. When she was crowned queen in 1533, this falcon emblem was displayed everywhere, replacing the pomegranate emblem of her predecessor, Catherine of Aragon. She was executed on charges of treason, adultery, and incest, which were almost certainly fabricated. Before her execution, she joked that the executioner would have an easy job because she had a little neck. Anne Boleyn's hobby was falconry. This was a popular sport among the nobility in Tudor England, but it was usually dominated by men. Falconry is the art of hunting with trained birds of prey. It requires skill, patience, and a deep understanding of the birds. For Anne, it was more than just a sport, it was a statement. In the world of the Tudor court, every activity was symbolic. Falconry was the sport of kings. By excelling at it, Anne was showing that she was the equal of any man. She was known to be an expert falconer. She would ride out with the king in his court, her own hawk on her gloved fist. This was a public display of her confidence and her status. It showed that she was not just a pretty face. She was a partner to the king, someone who could share in his passions and his power. The symbolism of the falcon was also important. Falcons are predators. They are noble, fierce, and independent. This was how Anne saw herself and how she wanted others to see her. Her choice of the white falcon as her personal badge was a bold move. It was a symbol of her ambition and her victory. She had pursued the king, and she had won him. She had replaced the old queen. The falcon had landed. Her participation in the hunt was also a key part of her courtship with Henry. The hunt was a semi-private space where they could be together, away from the prying eyes of the court. Their shared love of the sport helped to build their bond. It was during these long days of riding and hunting that their relationship deepened. This hobby also reveals her competitive nature. Falconry is a competitive sport. Anne was known to be ambitious and determined. She fought for 7 years to become queen. The same focus and drive she applied to her political goals, she also applied to her sport. For Anne, falconry was not a gentle pastime. It was a reflection of her personality and her political ambitions. It was a way to operate in a man's world, on her own terms. In a court full of intrigue and danger, the clear, sharp world of the hunt, with its rules and its focus on skill, must have been a welcome escape. But it was also a performance. On the hunting field, as in the court, she was always demonstrating her worth, her power, and her right to be queen. Her hobby was a perfect metaphor for her life, a daring, high-stakes flight that ended in a tragic fall. Number 2, did a Dutch queen's painting pay for resistance? Wilhelmina of the Netherlands was queen for 58 years, one of the longest reigns in Dutch history. During World War I, she managed to keep the Netherlands neutral. During World War II, she became a symbol of the Dutch resistance while leading the government in exile from London. She was one of the richest women in the world, with a personal fortune that made her the world's first female billionaire in today's money. Queen Wilhelmina had a secret life. She was a talented and dedicated painter. This was not a casual hobby. It was a serious, lifelong passion. She painted mostly landscapes in a style influenced by the Hague School, a Dutch impressionist movement. She would set up her easel outdoors in the gardens of her palace or in the Dutch countryside and paint for hours. Her art was her private world. It was a place where she could escape the immense pressures of being a monarch. When she was painting, she was not the queen. She was just an artist, observing the light and the colors of the world around her. She signed her paintings simply Wilhelmina, without any royal titles. She wanted her work to be judged on its own merits. She was surprisingly good. She exhibited her work publicly, sometimes in group shows with other artists. She sold her paintings, and they were popular. But she didn't use the money for herself. She donated the proceeds to charity. This was her way of connecting her private passion to her public duty. But her most interesting hobby was not painting. It was business. Wilhelmina was an incredibly shrewd investor and businesswoman. She inherited a large fortune, but she managed it and grew it exponentially. She invested in industries that were crucial to the Dutch economy, like oil and shipping. She had a deep understanding of finance. She would study stock market reports and company statements. She made her own investment decisions, often against the advice of her male financial advisors. This was highly unconventional for a monarch, especially a female one. Monarchs were supposed to be above commerce. But Wilhelmina saw her wealth as a tool. It gave her independence and power. Her financial acumen was legendary. She became the principal shareholder in companies like Royal Dutch Shell and KLM, the Dutch national airline. Her two hobbies, painting and business, seemed very different, but they both came from the same place, a desire for a life beyond the strict confines of her royal role. Painting gave her emotional and creative freedom. Business gave her financial and political freedom. Her vast personal wealth meant she was not dependent on the government for money. It gave her leverage. During World War II, her personal fortune was a crucial asset for the Dutch government in exile. She used her own money to help fund the war effort and support the Dutch resistance. Her strange, unqueenly hobby of playing the stock market had become a vital tool in the fight for her country's freedom. Wilhelmina was a complex figure, a stoic queen, a sensitive artist, and a ruthless capitalist. Her hobbies were not just escapes, they were the secret sources of her strength. Number 1. What did a queen sketchbook reveal about her empire? Queen Victoria had a custom-made traveling watercolor set that she took with her everywhere. She and her husband, Prince Albert, learned the art of etching together from a famous painter. They made dozens of etchings of their children and their dogs. These were meant to be private, but a disgruntled printer stole some of the plates and published the images, causing a minor royal scandal. Victoria filled over 120 large albums with her personal sketches and watercolors. Queen Victoria is often remembered as a stern, unsmiling figure in black. But behind that public image was a woman with a deep and lifelong passion for drawing and painting. From a very young age, she was rarely without a sketchbook. It was her way of recording her life and understanding the world around her. Her hobby was obsessive documentation. She drew everything. She sketched her children as they played. She drew portraits of the people she met, from visiting royalty to local Scottish villagers. She painted the landscapes she saw on her travels. Her sketchbooks are an intimate visual diary of her entire reign. They show a side of her that is warm, observant, and full of curiosity. She was a talented amateur artist. Her drawings are detailed and full of life. She had a good eye for character. Her portraits capture the personality of her subjects. Her landscapes show her deep love for the Scottish Highlands, where she felt most at home. She and Albert would often sit and sketch together. It was a shared passion that brought them very close. Art was a central part of their family life. They taught all of their 9 children to draw and paint. But her hobby was more than just a personal pastime. It was connected to her role as the ruler of a vast global empire. She was fascinated by the different cultures and peoples of the British Empire. She would often ask visitors from India or Africa to sit for her so she could draw them in their traditional dress. She commissioned professional artists to travel the empire and paint pictures of the landscapes and people. Her own artwork, however, reveals a particular worldview. Her sketches of her Indian servants, for example, are often romanticized. They are depicted as loyal, exotic figures. Her art helped her to process and make sense of the empire she ruled, but would never fully visit or understand. It was a way of bringing the empire home, of domesticating it and fitting it into her own personal world. Her sketchbooks are a unique historical record. They provide a personal, unfiltered view of her life and times. They show us the world through her eyes. We see the big historical moments, like the opening of the Great Exhibition, but we also see the small, private moments, a child sleeping, a dog by the fire. This hobby reveals the complexity of Victoria. She was a queen, an empress, a wife, and a mother, but she was also an artist. Her sketchbooks were her private space, a place where she could observe, reflect, and create. They show a more sensitive, more human side to the formidable monarch. Her lifelong habit of drawing was not just about making pretty pictures, it was her way of trying to capture and control the rapidly changing world over which she reigned. It was an empress's attempt to hold her entire world within the pages of a book.